Today our guest is James Wesley Rawles. Jim Rawles is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer and novelist, nonfiction writer, and editor of survivalblog.com. His blog is very widely read and has more than 320,000 unique visits each week. He lives at a self-sufficient ranch that is surrounded by national forest somewhere in the American Redoubt. His novels have been called survival manuals dressed as fiction. Welcome, Jim. Glad to have you on.
Thanks for having me on, Rick.
First, I'd really like to thank you for what you do. Your books and the Survival Blog have helped myself and so many other people become prepared and better prepared and more aware of what can happen to all of us if we're not prepared. In my own case, I was a prepper all my life. Always been, self-improvement and self-sufficient fanatic, but not really a novel reader. I read a lot of self-help and manuals and how to do it sort of books. And your book, Patriots, was recommended by another book I happened to be reading, so I picked it up and then couldn't put it down. Mine was, I think, one of your first edition. It had the cover of had money burning on it, as opposed to the guy in ACUs, which I think is the new cover you have on there. But I think it's so true that your novels have been called survival manuals dressed as fiction, because mine is highlighted, underlined, notes in the margins, and I went back after reading it and made lists of all the things that I needed to do and needed to get done and needed to get. So it was a great book in that it was written as a novel, and I gave the book to my friends, my family, my kids, who always kind of looked at me cross-eyed, and even my dad got on board after reading your book. So I thank you for that, and your survival blog was a great reference for my wife to get on board too. So thank you, Jim, for myself, my family, and for all the preppers I've met that have read your work, because I think you've done great things with it.
Well, thank you.
Your bio mentions redoubt. Do you want to explain that term a little bit so that
Sure.
the audience understands what it is?
The American Redoubt is a strategic relocation plan that I developed where I'm encouraging like-minded people to relocate to a 5-state area in the inland northwest of the United States. And specifically that refers to Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and the eastern half of Oregon and the eastern half of Washington State. And that region was selected because of its low population density, its plentiful hydroelectric power, and its relatively diverse agriculture. I think it's, because of its various attributes, it's probably the safest place anywhere in the continental United States for a family to live.
And I think somebody called it, you've got God-fearing, law-abiding people there, like the Puritan Exodus from Europe or something, and pistol-packing Amish, I think somebody said something like that. So that's great. Well, Jim, you would not have been able to write such novels without having been an expert yourself. So let's talk about what's going on in preparedness these days. What do you see as the 3 most likely disasters that America faces?
Well, I would have to say presently they would be an economic collapse, probably triggered by a global credit crisis or derivatives crisis. The second would probably be an X-class solar flare, because we're presently, even though we've had ridiculously low sunspot numbers, we're actually approaching the peak of the solar cycle. We're just having a very weak peak this time, but the major solar flares actually happen the most when there is a weak peak. And then the third most likely, I would say, would be a global pandemic, most likely an influenza pandemic. And by preparing for any of those, a lot of the same preparations you'll make apply to all 3 of those situations, because we're talking self-sufficiency, things like gardening with non-hybrid seeds, which I'm sure you've talked about a lot on your show, the importance of food storage, water filtration, advanced first aid skills, and so forth. And in my writings, I put a very strong emphasis on pre-1900 technology. The 19th century technologies, I think, are appropriate because if the national power grids go down, we could very easily revert to that level of technology just about overnight. And unless people are ready to do that, reverting to that level could be very difficult, very painful, and in fact downright deadly to most of our citizenry. Most people are not prepared to revert to that level of technology, and that's why I encourage people to lay in the tools and practice the skills to be ready for that.
All right, so it's financial collapse, number one, EMP or solar flare, number two, and pandemic, number three. But
yes.
As I've often said, it almost doesn't really matter what it is. The ultimate result's going to be the same. So you basically need to be prepared to be self-sufficient.
Right, and in fact, the common denominator with all three of those would be a collapse of the three national power grids. And again, the same preparations apply to all of those situations. The only one that's the real outlier, of course, is a nuclear attack where you would need to have shielding from fallout. But pretty much all the other preparations you're going to make apply. It's important that families, if they can, move to a lightly populated area like the American Redoubt and be prepared to hunker down for an extended period of time to be as self-sufficient as possible. And in the case of a pandemic, they also need to be prepared to live in absolute isolation if it's a bacteria or virus that's transmitted by casual contact rather than on the winds.
I noticed in your latest book, which I had the opportunity to read before we talked here, was that you have an area in Florida that is pretty much landlocked, and they were able to basically quarantine themselves to keep out a pandemic.
Yes, that was the Lake County, Florida region. There's so many lakes that they effectively, for some areas in central Florida, create a chain of moats around a lot of cities. And all it would take is blocking off a few bridges and causeways, and you could achieve that kind of isolation.
I have to tell you that I read your book with great interest because having lived in Lake County, Florida for a number of years and having made the commute from Orlando to the other side of Lake County, you depicted it extremely well. And, I always thought it was interesting that it really was surrounded by moats. So, somebody could attack it by water maybe, but by land it would be pretty tough to do. So, you did a great job on depicting the area. I'll say that for you.
Thank you.
So, why did you start writing novels before you wrote any survival manuals?
Well, I realized that most people will not take the time to sit down and read a 300 or 400-page survival manual. People just aren't geared that way, and people's attention spans in our modern era are not geared that way. But a lot of people will sit down and read a 300-page novel. So what I devised doing was weaving a lot of practical and tactical tips into a fictional storyline. And then most people that have a good head on their shoulders will end up reading my books twice. The first time through for fun because they're an exciting roller coaster kind of ride. But they'll also read the book a second time with a notepad and a yellow highlighting pen in their hand, taking notes. And I've been told that it works pretty well.
For sure. Yeah. I'm guilty of that for sure, especially, when I was reading Patriots, I was doing a lot of highlighting and underlining and, making notes afterwards and that sort of thing. So it was great for me too. And I also noticed that in your writing style, especially in this latest book, it has a lot of really sort of short chapters, and being a guy that spent really kind of a lifetime in the media, television, film business. It feels very much like reading a script where you're jumping from one area to another and kind of leaving situations, and it works really well, I think, in the writing because it just keeps your interest, and you're always wondering what happened to the folks that you just left. Was there?
Part of that was intentional because e-books are becoming so predominant. I realized that if you're scrolling through an e-book and you get into a chapter that's 20 or 30 pages long, you kind of lose track of where you are.
Right.
If you have chapters that are only 3 to 5 pages long, and you always have an indicator at the beginning of each chapter where the location is and the time frame, it helps keep people on track. So for all my novels from here on out, I think I'm going to stick to short chapters. It also gives me a great excuse to include more quotations. I'm an inveterate collector of quotations, and I lead each chapter with a quote, and that gives me that many more chances to include quotes in my book.
I could see that, and I was paying a lot of attention to those quotations too, because a lot of them really hit home. And those are the kind of things you can go back and highlight and make lists of as well, I'm sure. You often mention power grids and call them the linchpins of our modern society. What in your mind is the significance of the grids, and what would life be like without them?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think without them we would revert to 19th century technology, if not earlier, without the grids. Unfortunately, we have a society that's very complex and very interdependent. We have extremely long chains of supply, where the food that you're looking at on your grocery shelf has traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles, and it's often changed hands as many as 8 or 10 times before it ever gets to you, going through the whole packaging and distribution chain. And the power grids play into so many things, so many aspects of our lives, that without the grid, I don't think life as we know it really could carry on. If you look at architecture for the last 30 years, for example, in industry and in retail sales, almost all the architecture now is concrete slabs that are tilted up and giving us the big box store effect. And those work great. They're very efficient with the power grid. But when the power grid goes down, what we're going to have are a bunch of big empty caves, big dark caves, because they really aren't designed to take advantage of natural lighting or natural air circulation. So they really won't be practical for carrying on any kind of business. I can't imagine, people wandering around with flashlights pulling things off the shelf, and then they'd come to the cash register, and of course the cash register won't work. They really don't have, with modern retail, they don't really have a way to revert to a traditional cash till even. So I think with the power grid involved in so many aspects of our lives, we need to recognize that its absence will necessitate some huge changes. And if the grid goes down and stays down for more than a week, I think we're going to start to see a massive die-off of population in the country, especially if that happens in wintertime.
Mm-hmm. I would tend to agree, and I find that to be the case. And when I did my own research for how I wanted to make my final stand here, and as the listeners know, I've got a self-sustaining homestead with farm and everything else, and I really did a lot of research into how people lived before there was electricity and all these modern conveniences of refrigeration and air conditioning, etc. And I know that your book, your latest one, does mention that in Florida, and when people start trading again and start trying to find ways to do retail, all of those traditional retail outlets just don't work because of the fact that they just trap that heat. There's no way to get rid of it. There are no windows, and also no light. So that makes total sense to me. Well, we need to take a short commercial break, and we will be back here with Jim Rawles and continue talking about his books, his prepper expertise, and how he thinks things are going to go down in the future. So we will be right back. This is Jim Rawles on Secrets of Survivalist radio show. Jim is the author of Patriots. His new book, Ex-Patriots, is just coming out October 1st, and he's written a number of novels and manuals, and also the survival blog, or survivalblog.com. And we're talking to him today about preparedness in general and what we need to do to be more prepared. Jim, welcome back. I'm glad you're here. And what is the highest priority for family preparedness in your mind?
I would say water filtration is probably right at the very top of the list. Because if you look at natural disasters and man-made disasters over the last 50 years, one of the common denominators is an interruption of civic water supplies. And if the power grid goes down, of course, within 72 hours, most civic water supplies are going to fail, because probably 90% of the civic water supplies in the United States are not gravity-fed from end to end. There's an electric pump in there somewhere in most of those systems. And in fact, as I mentioned in one of my previous novels, the EPA's turbidity standards for water purity have necessitated filtration in a lot of systems, and in most cases that means they've had to add electric pumps to what were previously all gravity-fed systems. So if we see a grid failure or a major storm or earthquake, we're going to see disruption of water supplies. So it's absolutely essential that every family have a good quality water filter, and I actually recommend buying a couple. One would be a compact water filter that you could carry in a backpack or in your car, and the other would be a large ceramic water filter like a Big Berkey or Big Berkey clone that you would have it in your home, so that if you're collecting water from open sources, whether it's water from your downspouts off your roof or water from a pond or a stream, you can run it through that and drink water with safety.
Mm. And what do people do who are in a more suburban or urban environment? How are they going to get water?
They're going to be in trouble, because half the problem is not just finding sources of open water, but there's a couple of other issues. One is the water that's there will probably be horribly fouled, because modern day first world people really don't know how to live with third world sanitation standards. They don't know how to revert. They don't think about fouling the water upstream of where other people are going to be drinking. So we're going to have a public health crisis of huge proportions. That's one reason water filtration is so important. The other is the whole security aspect. You may know where there's a local pond or a stream, but if you have to have an armed guard to make sure that you can get back to your house or apartment safely with the water that you find, that adds a whole other dimension. And if you think this through to a situation where we're without electricity or without gasoline for an extended period of time, you have to think in terms of what kind of containers you could use, or something like a two-wheeled garden cart, for example, would be ideal for hauling heavy containers of water. At 8 pounds per gallon, it adds up in a real hurry.
Right.
So in the suburbs or an urban area, it could be very difficult, especially if you have a long distance to travel. For anyone in those kind of situations, if they don't have water nearby, they need to think about getting out of town very quickly, basically ahead of the pack, ahead of what I call the golden horde, so that they can get safely to a rural area where there is plentiful water and a safer place to be in the event of a collapse.
And of course, with a power grid down or eventually down, people aren't going to be able to pump water out of their wells either, so they're going to have other sources to be able to.
Right. Well, at least deep wells, it'll be problematic. And a lot of people who have backup generators don't stop to think that if they have a 120-volt generator that does not have a winding for 220 volts or 240, they won't be able to pump water with their well pump because most well pumps are 220-volt AC. There's a couple of workarounds. One is what's called a bullet bucket, where it's a cylindrical bucket that you can drop into a well, but they're very labor-intensive. And, of course, if you're in a shallow well area, one thing that we've done here at our ranch is we have a couple of backup wells that are drilled only about 30 feet deep. And if you're pumping less than 1 atmosphere, which is 33 feet, you can use a traditional pitcher-style hand pump where the pump cylinder sits above the ground. If you go deeper than 1 atmosphere, you have to have the pump cylinder at the bottom of the well shaft and have the cylinder connected by what's called a sucker rod, which is like on a traditional windmill pump that goes up and down to be able to pump water from any depth greater than 33 feet.
That's great to know. And I'm sure rainwater collection, that sort of thing is going to be important.
It is essential, yes. And I recommend that people convert their downspouts now. If they're going to have their house re-roofed anytime in the next 5 years, I recommend that they re-roof with a metal roof for a couple of reasons. One is better fire protection, and the other is if you have a composition roof, they have a lot of grainy, nasty stuff that gets into the water that was less than desirable to have in your water. So switch to a metal roof if you can. And then you can convert your downspouts by shortening them, and there's what's called a Y diverter. With those, you can, whenever there's a rain shower, you can let the water go out onto the ground at first, and then after the roof is rinsed clean, you can switch the Y diverter to fill water barrels.
I've got something similar with rainwater collection that we've got here on the farm, and we've got what they call a first flush downspout, where basically the bad stuff and the bird droppings and everything just comes off the roof, and that fills that up first. So at least the worst stuff is in that tube, and then you just open that up afterwards and let all that bad stuff out and let it fill up again. So that. Yeah, I'm in total agreement. I mean, according to the rule of threes, you've got 3 days to live without water, and that's going to be an essential thing for people when the grid goes down for any length of time. And I think you're absolutely right that the vast majority of people are going to start dying off shortly after that if they don't have water and can't take it from somebody else.
Yeah, it could be a very ugly situation very quickly. And again, I think that people, if they can't make a move now, need to have a well-stocked retreat that they're ready to go to at a moment's notice. And having it well-stocked means a couple of things. One is you're not going to waste a lot of time packing, and the other is you'll have a much larger base of logistics when you get there than what you could carry in just your own vehicle. And one other thing, of course, is that you can have a vehicle without a trailer, which will make you much more mobile in the event that you have to change your route. It's very difficult to back up with a trailer in traffic, so it's best to have everything pre-positioned in advance with trustworthy friends and neighbors.
I couldn't agree more. And back to the rule of threes, you can live 3 weeks without food. Why is it important to have food storage and, near and dear to my heart, a garden for self-sufficiency?
Well, I think that it's crucial to recognize that most American families only have about a 2 or 3 day supply of food on hand. And if you're in that situation yourself, your listeners have to think, well, what do I really need to get me through a crisis? Well, if it's a grid down crisis, it could go on for months. So it's important to have months and months worth of food storage. And then in the really long term, it's important to have a self-sufficient garden. And as I'm sure you know, Rick, it takes a long time. There's a steep learning curve to gardening. And you really need to get used to your own particular climate zone, your own weather patterns, and to learn which varieties grow well in your particular climate zone. There's a lot to be learned, and it takes time. And even if you have a wonderfully self-sufficient garden, it's still important to have food storage because you never know when you're going to have a failed crop.
Mm-hmm.
So the two complement each other very well. And as I'm sure you've mentioned in your show, the important seed to store is what's called non-hybrid or open-pollinated or heirloom variety seed, which breeds true from generation to generation. You don't want to stock up all hybrid seeds. You want to have some non-hybrid seeds as well. For your first season, it would be great to have some really high-yield hybrids, but it's important that you also have a large quantity of non-hybrid seed. And just like your extra storage food, your extra gardening seed will be very important for charity and for barter. So stock up a lot.
Mm. And I think you're absolutely right about people needing to understand how to do some of these things, because unfortunately, I talk to people who say, well, I've got, 3 years worth of seed stored up, but they've never planted a garden before. And they don't know
they
what
have a very painful comeuppance.
Mm-hmm. And the time to learn is not when it's life or death survival on your part.
Exactly.
It's just amazing. But that's part of the reason that I promote this secret gardener survival, this perennial food forest that I've developed, because you plant it once and you can harvest for a lifetime, and it's based on what people have traditionally lived on as indigenous people for thousands of years, and it's basically fruits, nuts, and berries, and once you plant that, you don't really have to worry about it so much. And and when the times get hard, it's going to be a lot harder to maintain a garden, and just being outside may be dangerous. To have to plant and tend and do all the things that you normally have to do in a traditional garden, and the amount of energy it takes to have to maintain that as well is going to be tough when you get so many other things that you have to do.
Right, and the power inputs in terms of cultivation are so much less if you have a subsistence style, foraging style garden. And as you mentioned before, it doesn't really look like a garden. So you could have a band of looters pass through your property and not even realize that they're walking through an edible forest.
Exactly.
And they'll think there's nothing there. But if you have rows of corn, it's like setting up a flare, practically saying, "Oh, come loot me."
You're saying exactly what I've been saying for a year. I mean, that's exactly it. It's you really are putting a target on your back. And I tell people that if they've got a traditional row garden, if anybody sees it, first of all, even if there's nothing right there, they're going to assume that the house has food stored, and that makes that house a target too. Whereas,
that's right.
This perennial food forest that I have looks like overgrown underbrush from a distance, and it almost looks like the house was abandoned and the property was abandoned and somebody just let it go. So, you have no idea that there's food growing there. That's it. So food and food storage, it's near and dear to my heart. That's long-term survival for people. If they can live past the lack of water and potential pandemics that come. And I'm a firm believer that the unprepared, the uninitiated, and the folks that really haven't practiced are going to be a lot worse off, and perhaps not live long enough to be able to tell about it. So, what should we keep on hand for our family sanitation? Sanitation is going to be really important in the event of a long-term power failure.
Well, short term, you could probably get by with a portable toilet like the type they make for recreational vehicles that are not the high-end ones, where you just have a chemical toilet. Those work fairly well. But again, long term, you're going to need something more. I would recommend that you get a 55-gallon drum and take either a Sawzall or a cutting torch and cut out the top of that drum and set it up with a toilet seat. And you can bury that drum in an area where you're not upstream from drinking water, and build yourself a privy. And it takes some labor, it takes some time, but it's and then of course you'll want to have a privacy screen around it, or build a proper outhouse eventually. But that's the kind of thing that you're going to need for a long-term situation. And of course you'll need lots of toilet paper or substitute toilet paper. I mention in my books quite a bit just getting stacks of Metropolitan phone books. Because that's actually a fairly compact way to store toilet paper versus the fluffy toilet paper they have in rolls. And you'll also want to buy a few sacks of lime, so you can sprinkle lime in your privy to keep the smell down. And you want to actually be able to walk in there and not gag.
Right. Yeah, it's a whole different. So you mentioned toilet paper. That stuff takes up an awful lot of space. Takes up, it could be a tremendous amount of space that you could use for other things. I know that, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Survivor Jane or not, but survivorjane.com, she does this preparedness blog for women, which is, I think she's got 300,000 followers or something like that. But she's got this little thing she developed called the Heine hydrant, which is basically a little spray bottle, little garden sprayer that she melted the spray nozzle so it points up, and I think she was at a conference I was at, and she shocked her women audience by saying, "I haven't used toilet paper in 6 months." And of course, all their jaws dropped.
They're all gasping, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
but
essentially it's like a bidet, yes.
Yeah. That's not a small thing. I mean, let's talk for a minute about sanitation and how important that is. I mean, people can die from that, and they don't really understand it.
Well, as I mentioned before, people in the United States and Canada really don't have an appreciation of third world living standards, and they really have no clue about how to revert. I think that if the power grids go down and toilets are no longer magically flushing and water is no longer magically coming out of the tap, your average urbanite, and maybe even most suburbanites, are going to revert to a kind of a savage existence where they're going to be defecating just about everywhere. They won't even think to bury it, a lot of them. So we could have a public health nightmare in a very short period of time. And even if you do everything right, if you're in a high-density area, you're going to end up suffering for your neighbor's mistakes.
Another reason to move to a rural setting, for sure. You talk about well-balanced preparedness. What do you mean by that, and what does that include?
Well, I like to emphasize the fact that it's important to not overdo any particular area. I've constantly, with my consulting clients and readers from my blog, I either get emails or have conversations with, say, ham radio people who have every piece of electronics known to man and a really elaborate photovoltaic power system, but no food storage. Or, for example, I'll talk or correspond with people who are firearms enthusiasts, and they have every gun known to man and umpteen rounds of ammunition and cleaning kits and scopes and all the doodads, but don't have any first aid supplies or don't have any communications equipment. So it's all a matter of balance. You want to basically budget your resources so that you end up with all your bases covered: communications, first aid, nuclear, biological, and chemical preparedness, self-defense, gardening, cold weather clothing, traditional tools. All those bases have to be covered. And if you over-prepare in one area to the detriment of another, you're doing yourself and your family a disservice. So people need to seriously prioritize their preparedness, and you kind of bite the bullet. I've talked to people who sent me these huge lists of guns they have and said, well, if you don't have a 2-year food supply, it's time to sell off some of your extra guns. You have to be realistic about things.
That's also true, and understand what life will be like without electricity, possibly. And a friend of mine was, he was so proud of all the toys he had, all the guns he had, and all the ammunition he had, and he said he was totally prepared for the end of the world as we know it. And the person I was with happened to mention, was that an electronic or a manual safe that your guns are in? And he says, well, it's electronic. She says, what happens when there's an EMP? And he turned white as a ghost and was like, oh, wait a minute, what happened? Yeah, I've got all my arms locked up in this cabinet and I can't open it. So
yeah, the good news is the solution is a planter's peanut can. The safe body itself makes a pretty decent Faraday cage, so all you need to protect is the electronic dial itself. So you can tape a planter's peanut can over the top of the electronic keypad, and you probably tripled or quadrupled the resistance of that system to EMP.
Wow, what a great tip! What a great tip! And I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who've got electronic safes and get their guns in there, and they need to understand that. What a great tip that is. And speaking of which, what are the threats of EMP and solar flares? Are they being exaggerated by the media?
Actually, I don't think they are. If anything, they might be underemphasizing solar flares in particular. Now, EMP is kind of overrated. You see these scenarios on television where they show everyone's cars suddenly stopping. Well, if we had a field strength of EMP strong enough to shut down the electronic ignitions of most cars, you'd probably also be within the blast radius of a nuclear weapon. So EMP would be the least of your worries. Your car would be flying about 40 or 50 miles an hour, tumbling end over end, if we had enough field strength to fry its electronic ignition. So that's kind of overrated. But in general, I think that solar flares are underrated. And the other thing that's underrated is the long-distance coupling of both EMP or EMP-like waveforms from solar flares. The coupling I'm talking about is through basically every linear metallic object that stretches a long distance. So everything like railroad tracks, power lines, telephone lines, they're all going to act like antennas for EMP and gather it over long distance. And then anything that's connected to those systems will get fried. And that's another reason to have your house off-grid. And if you're going to buy a photovoltaic power system, do not buy one that's grid-tied. I know that that's the only way with a lot of state tax incentives they have for solar systems. They only allow a grid-tied system. But I say forego the tax write-off and buy a system that's completely standalone. Because if you have a photovoltaic power system that's not connected to the grid, you're not connecting yourself to EMP. All you're going to have is 30 or 40 feet of wire from your solar panels to your house, which is negligible for collecting EMP versus hundreds of miles of telephone lines and hundreds of miles of power lines. So it's important to go off-grid, and it'll make you that much more resistant to EMP.
One of my other guests on our previous show, Scott Hunt of Practical Preppers, he does a lot with electrical power and with water pumps, and really kind of he's an amazing engineer. I call him kind of today's MacGyver because he figures out ways to get things done. And he said it was really important to have power inverters in a Faraday cage, backups if you do have that kind of thing, because those can get fried.
Yeah, so. Also don't overlook spare charge controllers for a photovoltaic power system, because that's the most vulnerable piece, is the charge controller. And the inverters are a little less vulnerable, but the charge controllers are the crucial piece to have spares, and you want to keep those wrapped up in foil and just toss them in an ammo can. Or one of my favorite EMP shielding Faraday cages is a standard Christmas popcorn can. Those great big canisters that popcorn come in have a tight-fitting lid, and they make a perfect Faraday cage, and people throw them away all the time.
And that's the gift that just keeps on giving if you use it right. I have to confess that I have done the same thing. We're looking for all kinds of tins, and, you get these popcorn cans at Christmas time, and, this is like a perfect Faraday cage. What a great idea. So, yeah, I appreciate that. Well, we need to take another short break, and we will be back. And when we come back, let's talk a little bit about your new book, Patriots. So hang on, folks. We will just radio show with Jim Rawles, and we are talking about prepping in general and his books and survival blog. And he's got a new book out, which we need to talk about a little bit here, which I read, which was really fun and interesting and did keep me on the edge of my seat, called Patriots. Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about the storyline behind behind this new book?
Sure. The novel is set in the near future in the exact same socioeconomic collapse as my other novels, but it's a bit of a departure in that the characters are pretty much unrelated to the characters in my previous novels. So it's more or less of a standalone piece. The main characters are some American expatriates. There's a missionary family living in the Philippines, and there's also a young Texas oil man living in northern Australia. And I wanted to show the economic collapse from their perspective, and wanted to highlight the uncertainty that they would feel, because with communications down, they won't even know what's going on with their families in the States. And here they are living overseas in a different culture and feeling quite isolated and quite uncertain as this whole situation unfolds. In the case of the family in the Philippines, I don't want to give too much of the story away, but suffice it to say, in the power vacuum that's created when the U.S. military disappears, Indonesia becomes radicalized and starts pushing out in all directions, first into East Timor and Papua New Guinea and the Philippines. And with radical Islamists taking over the Philippines, things become very uncomfortable very quickly for Christian missionaries, since they're cutting their heads off. So they need to find their way out of the Philippines in a hurry, and with civilian air transport down and with no scheduled ships sailing to the United States, they find themselves out of luck and have to improvise. And a lot of the story has to do with how they get themselves to Australia. And they end up in northern Australia, and less than a year later, Australia is invaded by Indonesia. And that's where the story gets really interesting. Another part of the story takes place involving the sister of the wife in the missionary family, who lives in Central Florida. And I talk a lot about the particulars of Florida. It has a wonderful climate, but it also has a very high population density, and talked about how they would have to deal with large looter gangs coming out of cities like Orlando. So it's definitely a departure from my previous novels, and it gave me a chance to develop a lot of different tactics and techniques and technologies for survival, again, into a fictional storyline. I hope your listeners like it.
Yeah, it's great, and I really appreciate some of the things, and some of it was very eye-opening too, because I think when you're looking at it and you're reading about what's happening in a different country, you can sort of imagine what might happen here, whereas people might just go poo-poo it and go, well, if it was happening here, oh, that would never happen here. But the fact that it was happening in Australia was interesting, and I think you talk a little bit about the effects of gun control on a country and how that made them more vulnerable when they were invaded. I think there's some really good eye-opening insights in there, and the fact that Australia, when there was a worldwide financial crisis, they could do some things to change their situation, and that was interesting too. And I think a lot of the things that you talk about there are things that we need to be thinking about here. So, it's good, and I certainly recommend it to all the listeners. It's called Patriots.
That'll be released October 1st. From E.P. Dutton and Company, and it is available at pretty much every bookstore will have it, and it's also, of course, available through Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. And I encourage people to wait until the 1st of October to order it. It's what I refer to as a book bomb day. I'm hoping to see the book get up into the top 20 or the top 10 on Amazon. And the other advantage of waiting, of course, is you're going to get the very best possible price for the book. It's all based on the volume of orders that first day where they end up setting the price, and hopefully people end up saving $1 or $2 on the cover price of the book.
Oh, that's great. And again, I recommend the book to everybody. There's just so much information in it. It is one of those things that you can also, highlight and underline and make notes from and say, I need to think about doing that. And my situation is this, and I better not be in that situation again. So I, for one, got out of Florida a while ago for the very reasons that you talk about here, and I'm so glad I did. Jim, what are some of the things that are most overlooked by preppers?
Well, I would say one of the most important is teamwork. It's important that I know most preppers are very private people and very quiet about their preparations, but they need to open up at least to some family members and to some friends who might be like-minded and team up, because we're not going to get through a situation like this on our own. Unless you have neighbors and friends that you can trust, that you can rely upon, it will be very difficult to live through a societal collapse. You can't be on alert 24 hours a day. After just a couple of days, you're going to burn out, and you're going to drop your guard. So it really takes a neighborhood watch on steroids, and you need to have neighbors that you can trust. So it's important that you very cautiously find out where your neighbors are coming from, and if any of them are like-minded, you need to team up and train together, develop standardization for things like firearms and communications equipment, and plan ahead. Without teamwork, you're probably not going to do very well, especially if you're in an area with any significant population density. Another overlooked factor, I think, is advanced medical equipment. A lot of families have a first aid kit, but not many families are set up for trauma. Most people have never heard of trauma decks or C-locks, which are wound coagulants. Most people who have not served in the military in the last 10 years are not familiar with even how to use a tourniquet properly. So it's important that you get yourself set up with advanced first aid equipment so that you can be prepared for truly traumatic times where you can't get to a hospital.
In your book, you put in a plug for Dr. Bones and Nurse Amy's book, too. I think you mentioned that as a critical resource, and the folks that I've had on the show as well. So thank you for what you do.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Rick, for having me on. God bless.
Thanks for being on. Thanks. Thanks for joining us for this week's Secrets of the Survivalist radio show. I'm Rick Austin, author of The Secret Gardener Survival, How to Grow a Camouflage Food Forest. and I am your host here, where each and every week we talk with the best off-grid prepping and survival experts to discuss their own secrets of survival. From retreat construction to self-defense to growing food, each week you will learn something new that you can use for your own survival preparedness. This week our guest has been Jim Rawles. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate you being on. And to our audience, if you'd like to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn, just go to the Secrets of a Survivalist show page here on the Preparedness Radio Network, and you can find all the links. Or you can go to my website, which is secretgardenofsurvival.com, and you can find links as well. Survival preparedness. Today our guest is James Wesley Rawles. Jim Rawles is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer and novelist, nonfiction writer, and editor of survivalblog.com. His blog is very widely read and has more than 320,000 unique visits each week. He lives at a self-sufficient ranch that is surrounded by national forest, somewhere in the American Redoubt. His novels have been called survival manuals dressed as fiction. Welcome, Jim. Glad to have you on.
Thanks for having me on, Rick.
First, I'd really like to thank you for what you do. Your books and the survival blog have helped myself and so many other people become prepared and better prepared and more aware of what can happen to all of us if we're not prepared. In my own case, I was a prepper all my life. Always been, self-improvement and self-sufficient fanatic, but not really a novel reader. I read a lot of self-help and, manuals and how to do it sort of books. And your book, Patriots, was recommended by another book I happened to be reading, so I picked it up and then couldn't put it down. Mine was, I think, one of your first edition. It had the cover of had money burning on it, as opposed to the guy in ACUs, which I think is the new cover you have on there. But I think it's so true that your novels have been called survival manuals dressed as fiction, because mine is highlighted, underlined, notes in the margins, and I went back after reading it and made lists of all the things that I needed to do and needed to get done and needed to get. So it was a great book in that it was written as a novel, and I gave the book to my friends, my family, my kids, who always kind of looked at me cross-eyed, and even my dad got on board after reading your book. So I thank you for that, and your survival blog was a great reference for my wife to get on board too. So thank you, Jim, for myself, my family, and for all the preppers I've met that have read your work, because I think you've done great things with it.
Well, thank you.
Your bio mentions redoubt. Do you want to explain that term a little bit so that
Sure.
the audience understands what it is?
The American Redoubt is a strategic relocation plan that I developed where I'm encouraging like-minded people to relocate to a 5-state area in the inland northwest of the United States. And specifically that refers to Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and the eastern half of Oregon and the eastern half of Washington State. And that region was selected because of its third, most likely, I would say, would be a global pandemic, most likely an influenza pandemic. And by preparing for any of those, a lot of the same preparations you'll make apply to all three of those situations, because we're talking self-sufficiency, things like gardening with non-hybrid seeds, which I'm sure you've talked about a lot on your show, the importance of food storage, water filtration, advanced first aid skills, and so forth. And in my writings, I put a very strong emphasis on pre-1900 technology. The 19th century technologies, I think, are appropriate because if the national power grids go down, we could very easily revert to that level of technology just about overnight. And unless people are ready to do that, reverting to that level could be very difficult, very painful, and in fact downright deadly to most of our citizenry. Most people are not prepared to revert to that level of technology, and that's why I encourage people to lay in the tools and practice the skills to be ready for that.
All right, so it's financial collapse, number one, EMP or solar flare, number two, and pandemic, number three. But
yes.
As I've often said, it almost doesn't really matter what it is. The ultimate result's going to be the same. So you basically need to be prepared to be self-sufficient.
Right, and in fact, the common denominator with all three of those would be a collapse of the three national power grids. And again, the same preparations apply to all of those situations. The only one that's the real outlier, of course, is a nuclear attack where you would need to have shielding from fallout. But pretty much all the other preparations you're going to make apply. It's important that families, if they can, move to a lightly populated area like the American Redoubt and be prepared to hunker down for an extended period of time to be as self-sufficient as possible. And in the case of a pandemic, they also need to be prepared to live in absolute isolation if it's a bacteria or virus that's transmitted by casual contact rather than on the winds.
I noticed in your latest book, which I had the opportunity to read before we talked here, was that you have an area in Florida that is pretty much landlocked, and they were able to basically quarantine themselves to keep out a pandemic.
Yes, that was the Lake County, Florida region. There's so many lakes that they effectively, for some areas in central Florida, create a chain of moats around a lot of cities, and low population density, it's plentiful hydroelectric power, and it's relatively diverse agriculture. I think it's because of its various attributes, it's probably the safest place anywhere in the continental United States for a family to live.
And I think somebody called it, you've got God-fearing, law-abiding people there, like the Puritan Exodus from Europe or something, and pistol-packing Amish, I think somebody said something like that. So that's great. Well, Jim, you would not have been able to write such novels without having been an expert yourself. So let's talk about what's going on in preparedness these days. What do you see as the three most likely disasters that America faces?
Well, I would have to say presently they would be an economic collapse, probably triggered by a global credit crisis or derivatives crisis. The second would probably be an X-class solar flare, because we're presently, even though we've had ridiculously low sunspot numbers, we're actually approaching the peak of the solar cycle. We're just having a very weak peak this time, but the major solar flares actually happen the most when there is a weak peak. And then the third